In less than 24 hours, the ground north of Covelo, California, broke 3 separate times, each rupture measuring magnitude 4 or larger. Tuesday evening, a magnitude 4. 0, Wednesday afternoon, a magnitude 4. 1, then 59 seconds after that one finished, before the dust had settled or the last car alarm had stopped, a magnitude 4. 5, the strongest of the 3. 3 earthquakes, 1 day apart, all within a few miles of each other, all sitting directly on top of a fault the U.S. Geological Survey has flagged as capable of producing a magnitude 7. And this triple strike wasn't a random burst out of nowhere. It's the sharpest spike yet in a sequence that's now been building, without stopping, for close to 7 weeks straight. And it's happening in a state where several completely separate fault systems have, just within the past couple of years, independently been flagged by researchers as carrying more accumulated stress than they've had in decades, in some cases in centuries. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened in those 24 hours, how it fits into the longer sequence building since late June, and why this specific fault, sitting quietly in the coast ranges north of San Francisco, keeps forcing its way back into the conversation about California's much bigger earthquake problem. Because the Bartlett Springs Fault doesn't operate in isolation. It's one strand in a much larger network of faults across Northern California that scientists have been watching with real concern. And this week, it's the strand that lit up. Quick note before we start, subscribe if you want the next update the moment new data comes in. It's free and it genuinely helps. And if you're anywhere in Mendocino, Lake, Trinity, or Sonoma County, drop a comment. I want to know if you felt any of this firsthand. Let's start with exactly what happened, hour by hour, because the sequence leading into this triple strike is worth understanding in full. The current chapter of activity traces back to June 24th when a magnitude 5.6 earthquake, the largest single event in the entire sequence so far, struck north of Redwood Valley. 9 days later, on July 3rd, a magnitude 3.9 hit near Alder Springs, northeast of Covelo. Then came July 10th, a Friday, and it turned into a genuine mini-sequence all its own. At 3:05 in the afternoon, a magnitude 3.8 struck about 7 miles northeast of Covelo. 28 minutes later, at 3:33, a magnitude 2.7 hit almost the same spot. 20 minutes after that, at 3:53, a magnitude 2.5. Then, hours later, at 6:14 that evening, the largest of the day, a preliminary magnitude 4. 2 that the USGS quickly revised upward to magnitude 4. 4, centered 11 kilometers north of Covelo at a depth of just over 10 kilometers. The USGS's own automated system flagged that Friday evening event directly as, in the agency's own words, the potential mainshock of an earthquake sequence. 4 separate earthquakes on a single Friday, one of them significant enough for the agency's own detection system to treat it as the possible start of something larger. The following 2 weeks brought a steady trickle of smaller aftershocks scattered around Covelo, Potter Valley, and Hopland, mostly in the magnitude 1 to 2 range, the kind of background seismicity that barely registers outside of instrument readings, visible mainly to the handful of residents. Checking the USGS feed obsessively, and to the seismologists watching the sequence's decay curve for any sign it was either winding down or building towards something else. Then, on Tuesday, August 4th, at 5:25 in the evening, a preliminary magnitude 4.0 struck right at Covelo at a depth of about 7.5 kilometers, roughly 200 miles north of Santa Rosa. No damage, no injuries, business as usual for this sequence at that point. Less than 24 hours later came Wednesday. At 3:20 in the afternoon, a magnitude 4. 1 struck roughly 19 miles northwest of Covelo. 59 seconds later, before residents had even finished processing the first jolt, a second earthquake hit in nearly the same spot, magnitude 4. 5, the strongest single event of the week and one of the strongest of the entire sequence. A third quake, magnitude 3. 9 struck in almost the same window. 3 separate earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater within a single 24-hour stretch, capping off nearly 7 weeks of continuous activity along the same fault. That's the triple strike the headlines are pointing to, and it's a legitimate escalation worth taking seriously. Not because any single one of these earthquakes was catastrophic on its own. Magnitude 4s happen somewhere in California on a fairly routine basis, but because of what they're happening on top of and where. It's worth pausing on the difference between what seismologists call a mainshock-aftershock sequence and what they call a swarm, because this sequence has genuinely blurred that line. A classic mainshock-aftershock sequence looks like one big earthquake, followed by a gradually decaying tail of smaller ones, each one weaker than the last, fading out over days or weeks. A swarm looks different. No single dominant event, just a cluster of similarly sized earthquakes trading off which one is technically the largest, sometimes for weeks or months at a stretch. What's happened along the Bartlett Springs Fault since late June has features of both. The July 10th magnitude, 4. 4 got flagged by USGS's own detection system as a potential mainshock, the classic pattern. But instead of a clean, decaying tail afterward, activity kept reasserting itself, first with weeks of minor background shaking, then with Tuesday's 4, 0, then with Wednesday's 4, 1 and 4, 5 arriving back to back. That kind of re-escalation, an initial mainshock followed weeks later by an even larger, and then an even larger event, is exactly the pattern. That gets a fault's most active segment circled in red on a seismologist's map, not because it guarantees anything, but because it means the stress redistribution happening underground still isn't finished. So let's talk about the Bartlett Springs Fault itself, because you can't understand why this matters without understanding its place in California's broader fault network. The Bartlett Springs Fault is the easternmost of 3 roughly parallel, right lateral strike-slip faults, absorbing the grinding motion between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate north of San Francisco Bay. Closest to the coast runs the San Andreas Fault itself. East of that, the Makama Fault. East of the Makama, the Bartlett Springs Fault, running for about 100 miles from up near Round Valley and Covelo, south through Lake County, past the edge of Clear Lake, before stepping onto the Hunting Creek Fault and continuing as the Berryessa Fault into the broader Green Valley Fault system. These 3 faults essentially split the plate boundary's total accumulated stress between them, each one absorbing its own share. The Bartlett Springs Fault wasn't even formally recognized as regionally significant for earthquake hazard purposes until the 1980s, which is part of why the USGS has poured resources into new gravity surveys, new geologic mapping, and new hazard studies of this fault over just the past several years. Here's the detail that should reframe how you think about this fault's reach. In its own published assessment of the fault's southern segment, the USGS was explicit that even though the area immediately surrounding the fault is sparsely populated, it presents a potential seismic hazard to communities as far away as the San Francisco Bay region and Sacramento. This isn't a fault whose consequences stay contained to a handful of rural counties. A significant rupture here has been assessed by the agency's own scientists as capable of reaching 2 of the most densely populated regions in Northern California. Now here's why California's broader earthquake problem is genuinely relevant to a swarm happening on one rural fault in Mendocino County. Because the Bartlett Springs Fault isn't the only piece of this state's fault network that scientists have flagged as carrying serious unresolved stress right now. Just this year, researchers published new physics-based modeling of the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems, built using geological evidence stretching back 1,000 years, including radiocarbon dating of displaced sediment layers and tree ring records of past ground ruptures. They're finding stress on multiple segments of both faults has now reached the highest level recorded anywhere in that 1,000-year simulation. The research identified a specific junction called Cajun Pass, northeast of Los Angeles, as what they're calling an earthquake gate, a point where a rupture starting on the San Andreas could potentially jump onto the San Jacinto Fault, turning what might have been a single fault event into a combined rupture in the magnitude 7. 4 to 7. 8 range, threatening the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, and Riverside County simultaneously. One of the study's co-authors put the honest timeline bluntly. It could happen today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30, and on a geological timescale, there's genuinely no meaningful difference between those answers. Closer to the Bay Area itself, the Hayward Fault, which runs directly beneath Oakland, Berkeley, and Fremont, is widely considered by seismologists to be overdue for a major rupture, having last produced a significant earthquake back in 1868, well over a century and a half of accumulated stress with no comparable release since. It's frequently cited in USGS hazard modeling as one of the highest consequence fault segments in the entire state, not necessarily because of its raw size, but because of how densely populated and thoroughly built up the East Bay has become in the decades since 1868, with a modern rupture threatening a corridor of cities that barely existed the last time this fault let go. The Greenville Fault, running through the Livermore Valley in the Eastern Bay Area, carries an estimated maximum earthquake potential around magnitude 6, a 9 according to USGS scenario modeling. And the West Napa Fault, just south of the Bartlett Springs system, is the fault responsible for the magnitude 6. 0 South Napa earthquake back in August of 2014, a real, damaging earthquake that caused significant injuries and tens of millions of dollars in damage across Napa's wine country, a useful, concrete reminder of what even a moderate quake on one of these Northern California faults can actually do on the ground when it strikes somewhere with real population density. Put all of that together, and you get the real shape of California's earthquake problem. It's not one fault, it's a dense, interconnected network of faults across Northern California, several of which independent research has flagged in just the past couple of years as carrying unusually high accumulated stress, sitting beneath a region that's grown enormously in population and infrastructure since the last time many of these faults produced a major earthquake. The Bartlett Springs Fault, and this week's triple strike specifically, is simply the piece of that network that happens to be actively making noise right now. Let's bring it back to why the Bartlett Springs Fault specifically behaves the way it does. Because the mechanism matters for understanding what a swarm like this one actually signals. This fault creeps, meaning that instead of staying fully locked and storing up stress silently until it fails all at once, sections of it are constantly sliding past each other in small increments, releasing a portion of that stress gradually rather than catastrophically. Research using the fault's GPS monitoring network estimates a deep slip rate of about 7, 5 millimeters a year below roughly 13 kilometers depth, and the fault appears to creep continuously from the surface down to about that same depth on average. The creeping behavior is a big part of why this fault has historically produced fewer large damaging earthquakes than a fully locked fault of similar length would. But creep on this fault has never been uniform, and that's the detail that keeps seismologists from writing this fault off as low risk. Multiple independent studies have identified evidence of at least one locked patch within the broader creeping zone, a section that isn't sliding at all and is instead behaving like an ordinary, fully locked fault, quietly accumulating stress with no aseismic release valve. Detailed rupture simulations run specifically on this fault back in 2015 found that depending on how much of that locked patch ruptured, the resulting earthquake could range anywhere from magnitude 6, 32, up to magnitude 7, 24. Even accounting for all the creep happening around it, this fault is fully capable of producing a strong, damaging earthquake. Much of the reason it creeps at all comes down to a specific rock type. It cuts through called serpentinite, a mineral-rich material closely associated with fault creep throughout the broader San Andreas system. And the USGS has spent the past several years running new gravity and magnetic surveys specifically to map how far this serpentinite extends at depth. Work that's found more of it down there than surface geology alone had suggested, and work that's also revealed that existing scientific models of exactly how creep is distributed along this fault still don't agree with each other. That last point is worth sitting with for a second, because it's really the honest core of the story. Scientists don't have a fully settled picture of how this fault behaves, even after decades of study. And a live escalating sequence like the one that just produced 3 magnitude 4+ earthquakes in a single day is exactly the kind of real-world data that helps them refine that picture, whether or not it ultimately leads to anything larger. It's worth being concrete about what the upper end of that range, a magnitude 7 rupture, would actually mean on the ground, because capable of magnitude 7 can sound abstract until you translate it into something physical. A rupture that size would likely tear along a substantial stretch of the fault, producing strong to violent shaking directly along that zone and clearly felt moderate shaking spreading across multiple surrounding counties, potentially reaching toward the northern edge of the Bay Area depending on which segment gave way. Shaking on a large strike-slip earthquake like this can last 30 seconds or more, long enough to seriously stress older, unreinforced buildings and trigger landslides across the steep, heavily forested terrain. This fault runs through for most of its length. The communities most directly exposed, Covelo, the towns ringing Clear Lake, the smaller settlements scattered through Lake and Mendocino counties, tend to have older building stock and far less seismic retrofitting investment than the well-resourced cities sitting closer to the Bay Area faults we just walked through. None of that means this outcome is imminent. It's simply the honest, physical meaning behind the hazard classification this fault already carries, regardless of what this week's sequence ultimately does. For historical context, it's worth knowing this isn't the first time this fault has produced a notable earthquake. Back in 2016, a magnitude 5. One struck along the fault near Lake Pillsbury, described at the time as the most significant earthquake on this fault in 50 years, and it was felt clear from the coast into California's Central Valley. That event came and went without escalating into anything larger. It's a useful reminder that this fault does periodically produce earthquakes in the moderate range, and that historically, those events haven't been followed by anything more severe. As of the most recent USGS aftershock forecasting on the current sequence, the odds of a significantly larger earthquake in the following week remain low, generally in the low single digits or below, consistent with typical background behavior for a sequence of this size. No injuries and no significant structural damage have been reported from any of the earthquakes in this sequence, including Wednesday's triple strike. It's worth saying a word about the community actually sitting at the center of this sequence, because Covelo isn't just a coordinate on a USGS map. It's home to the Round Valley Indian Reservation and the surrounding town, a rural community of a few thousand people tucked into a mountain valley reachable by a single main highway. That geography cuts both ways when it comes to earthquake risk. On one hand, The sparse population here means a large rupture on this specific stretch of the fault would expose far fewer people directly than a similarly sized quake, striking closer to the Bay Area. On the other hand, that same isolation means emergency response can take longer to arrive, medical resources are thinner on the ground, and a major landslide or road failure triggered by strong shaking could genuinely cut the community off from outside help for a period of time. It's the same trade-off that shows up again and again in rural seismic hazard planning across Northern California: lower exposure, but also lower resilience once something does happen. There's also a genuinely useful piece of modern infrastructure working in this region's favor that's worth mentioning. Shake Alert, the USGS's earthquake early warning system, now covers all of California, Oregon, and Washington, serving more than 50 million residents, and it's specifically designed to give people even a few seconds of warning before the strongest shaking from a distant earthquake arrives. A few seconds might not sound like much, but it's enough time to drop, take cover, and protect yourself from the falling objects that cause the majority of earthquake injuries. It won't stop a fault from rupturing, but it's a genuine, tangible improvement in this region's readiness compared to just a decade or two ago. And it's active right now for anyone with the app or a participating phone carrier in this exact part of the state. So where does that leave the honest, grounded takeaway? The Bartlett Springs Fault just produced 3 earthquakes of magnitude 4, or larger, within a single day, the sharpest spike in a sequence that's now stretched across nearly 7 weeks. That fault is capable, by the USGS's own published assessment, of an earthquake up to magnitude 7, with hazard modeling explicitly extending its potential impact toward the San Francisco Bay Area and Sacramento. And it sits within a broader Northern California fault network where independent research over just the past 2 years has flagged multiple other segments, from the San Andreas near Cajon Pass to the long overdue Hayward Fault, as carrying real elevated stress of their own. None of that adds up to a prediction that anything larger is imminent. Sequences like this have happened on this fault before, including as recently as 2016 without escalating further. But it's exactly why, when 3 earthquakes strike the same fault in the same day, on a fault this specific and this well connected to the rest of the state's seismic hazard picture, the story reaches further than one rural corner of Mendocino County. If you live anywhere along this broader network, the standard advice is worth repeating, because it applies regardless of whether this particular sequence escalates or quietly fades out. Know how to drop, cover, and hold on. Secure water heaters and heavy furniture. Keep several days of water, food, and any necessary medication on hand, along with a basic emergency plan for your household. If you're in a landslide-prone area, and much of this fault's route through the coast ranges qualifies, know your evacuation routes in advance, rather than figuring them out during an actual event. None of that requires a bigger earthquake to be worth doing. It's simply the reality of living anywhere along one of the most active fault networks in the country, whether the fault in question is the famous one running along the coast, or the quieter one most people have never heard of until this week. It's also worth zooming out one more time before we close, because it's easy to come away from a story like this thinking either that nothing is happening or that everything is about to happen, and the truth sits in between. A triple strike of magnitude, 4+ earthquakes in a single day, is a genuine escalation worth covering, worth watching closely, and worth taking as a prompt to actually check your own preparedness rather than assume it's someone else's problem. It is not, on the evidence available right now, a confirmed sign that a much larger earthquake is about to follow. Sequences like this have played out on this exact fault before, including the 2016 event, without turning into anything bigger. But the broader pattern underneath it, a fault with genuine, documented uncertainty in its own creep behavior, sitting inside a state where several other major fault systems have independently been flagged for elevated stress just within the past 2 years, is exactly why California's earthquake problem, as a whole, keeps getting harder to treat as background noise. We'll keep tracking the sequence as new data comes in, and we'll bring you the next update the moment anything changes. Subscribe if you want that followed in real time, and let me know in the comments which fault in this broader network you want us to cover next. See you in the next one.